Hello and welcome to Outland Japan. I'm your host, Peter Carnell, a travel guide based in northern Nagano, and this is a podcast that takes you outside the big cities into rural, regional, and the wilds of Japan. And it very much is the wilds of Japan that we head into today in discussion of Japan's mountain religion of Shugendo. My guest leading us in that discussion is Dr. Caleb Swift Carter of Kyushu University. Dr. Carter specialises in Buddhist Studies and the medieval and early modern religious history of Japan, with a focus on the mountain tradition of Shugendo. As such, he's ideally suited to guide us in exploration of what I consider to be one of the more interesting aspects of Japanese culture. We spend a lot of time in and on the mountains of Japan on this podcast. It's intentional. According to the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, approximately 3/4 of Japan is designated mountainous or rugged. This is a country of mountains where many peaks are considered sacred, the realms of gods and spirits, demons and dragons. You don't have to take any interest at all in the religious underpinnings of the role mountains play and have long played in Japanese culture. But I believe the value many of us take from time spent in these landscapes, the awe, the wonder, the inherent peace we experience when faced by the natural beauty of such places, is at some level spiritual. An understanding of the religious context of mountains in Japan can only amplify the enjoyment we take from the time spent there. And for that reason, I really wanted to bring you this episode. In exploration of Shugendo with Dr. Carter, we focus on the mountain of Togakushi in Nagano. It was the focus of his book, A Path into the Mountains, Shugendo and Mount Togakushi, a book which was of personal interest to me as I regularly guide at Togakushi. We've actually visited Togakushi before on the podcast in episode 12, which was my travel guide to Togakushi, one of my favourite destinations in central Japan. This episode builds upon that travel guide by going into a lot more detail about the history and significance of the mountain. Also worth mentioning that episode 9 of the podcast, How to Die Well in the Mountains, Way of the Yamabushi, was my interview with Tim Bunting, who practices as a Yamabushi, that's a follower of Shugendo, in Yamagata. Another episode worth listening to in combination with this one. Caleb is a mountaineer himself and explained to me that his next area of study is exploring the religious elements identifiable within modern mountain climbing, something I'll be interested to read, and I hope this topic also appeals to you. I know many of you love the mountains. I hope this episode furthers your love, respect and wonder for the complexity of Japan's mountain landscapes. As always, links to everything, including Caleb's book, A Path into the Mountains, Shugendo and Mount Togakushi, are in the show notes. Happy New Year, everyone. I hope you enjoy. My guest on the podcast today is Dr. Caleb Swift Carter, a specialist in Buddhist studies with a particular interest in the mountain faith system of Shugendo, a topic we've touched upon before on the podcast. So I'm very much looking forward to exploring that a little bit deeper today. Caleb, thank you for making time to speak with me. And firstly, how are you?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'm doing great, and this is a great opportunity. So thank you for inviting me onto your podcast.
Now, important to say that we're speaking to each other from quite distant points on the globe today. So where are you? Where are you speaking from?
Correct. Yeah, I usually would be closer to you in Fukuoka in southern Japan, but I'm currently in the Boston area, and I'm a visiting scholar at the Harvard Yenching Institute for the year.
So I became acquainted with your research and your writing through your book, A Path into the Mountains, Shugendo and Mount Togakushi. For listeners who are not familiar with you, though, would you mind introducing yourself, a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in this aspect of Japanese culture?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for picking up my book. It's exciting to have it out there and have people finally reading about what I've been up to for a decade or so of research. Mountains and religion, these are my two interests. Beginning with mountains, which I think is an interest shared by many of your listeners. I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S., especially, my family moved around a lot, but we were in North Carolina and the Appalachia down there, summers up in the Adirondack Mountains. I kind of grew up on hikes and camping, and, I think at middle school age or so, I got dragged along by my parents, but eventually I came to love the mountains. Ended up in Colorado College, where outside of a major in philosophy, I was getting into the mountains as much as I could to learn how to mountaineer, how to rock climb, things like that. And then in terms of religion, I grew up in a religious setting in an Episcopal family. My dad's actually a minister. And so I think I grew up with sort of some questions in my mind about, for instance, God, who or what dimension is all of this about in terms of the Episcopal faith. And I was also interested in Asian religions and cultures growing up. I did a semester abroad in Nepal and just absolutely fell in love with it there. And ended up in Japan, I think partly because I was interested in Zen and Shinto and the religions of Japan. But for practically speaking, I also got a job teaching English with a JET program. So I was in Kumamoto for 3 years and applied to graduate school toward the end of that. Ended up at UCLA for my MA and PhD in Buddhist Studies. And then from there, I taught a few years there after finishing my PhD. Then I had a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, where I was working on the book that you just mentioned. And then in 2018, our family moved to Fukuoka, where I took up a job as assistant professor at the time of religions, focusing especially on Japanese religions.
So a fascinating and very wide area of study. I'd like to start with what is probably not a simple question, but for listeners, again, who are not particularly familiar with Japanese religious traditions, could we start with what is Shugendo? How would you describe it to somebody?
Shugendo. Okay, so take the word itself. Do is the same do as in Shinto or in Taoism, the Tao, so meaning the way. And then Shugen basically means something like to cultivate special powers. And so the idea behind Shugendo is that it's the mountains where these powers are. And so it could be Buddhas or Bodhisattvas in the Buddhist tradition. It could be local gods, could be dragons, sometimes even demonic forces. But all of these beings have this power. And through special techniques and rituals and Buddhist knowledge, the practitioner of Shugendo can basically go into the mountains and acquire those powers, and then use those powers either in an individual sense, like say for their own spiritual advancements, or to pass on to followers. And so they come out of the mountains, then they have these kind of supernatural powers they can use for people in terms of divination with crops for the coming season, or healing rituals, exorcism, all types of things. I should also say that I'm speaking more in a historical sense. I think Shugendo still exists today, but for different reasons, maybe we can come back to later. But yeah, that's sort of a Shugendo maybe in a nutshell.
And I think a lot of listeners, again, would be probably familiar, or at least heard of, Shintoism and certainly Buddhism and the role that they play in Japan. Could you go into a little bit as to how Shugendo differs or relates to Shintoism and Buddhism in the Japanese context?
Yeah, I think what's most distinctive is the mountains, right? So Buddhism, and as it came in the 6th century and developed over time, especially in, say, the Heian period, so 9th century, 10th century, earlier too, there was temples that were in the mountains. And so Buddhist priests would go into the mountains and they'd perform practices of asceticism. So maybe dwelling there for extended periods of time, living very simple lives in order to advance their own paths. And Shugendo comes out of that. Well, scholars will debate this question. Through the research that I've done, and some other historians of Shugendo, a placement might be more like 15th, 16th century, where you start to have kind of a self-conscious system. And by that, I mean that there's a word, Shugendo, that people recognize. There's practitioners that ascribe to Shugendo that would self-identify that way. There's sort of an institutional apparatus, several different sects that emerge in the Edo period. And so it really does come out of different strands of Buddhism, especially esoteric Buddhism, the Tendai and Shingon traditions, which are really about advancing your own practice through sometimes ritual techniques that are secretive, that you are initiated into, and that you can basically, through these techniques, assimilate or unify with particular Buddhas or bodhisattvas. And it's that assimilation that allows you to acquire these powers and advance quite rapidly along the path. We can think of it as a Buddhist tradition, and yet it's also different in certain respects too. And practitioners of Shugendo would distinguish themselves from more established types of Buddhism. Shinto, I think, has a sort of similar historical trajectory. Well, I should say that with Shugendo, it's often been thought of as sort of a folk religion that people sort of take it out of historical context. So it's, placing it back historically when you don't even have the term Shugendo. Shinto has been commonly thought of too as sort of the native tradition in Japan. And some scholars will still argue that. But another way to think of it is also through the concept of what Shinto is, especially in juxtaposition to Buddhism.
So it's really the practice of entering the mountains and the relationship with those mountains that defines Shugendo in large parts from Shintoism or Buddhism.
Yes, I think that's true for practice. Yep, that's a nail on the head there. Take, for example, a place of typical ritual service in Buddhism compared to Shugendo. There's a fire ritual. It's called the Goma ritual in Japanese. That's actually a transliteration from the Homa ritual in ancient India. It gets picked up in Buddhism and travels across. And so basically, the Goma ritual in a Shingon context, for example, would be conducted inside a Goma hall in a temple complex. So it's inside. Your eyes are burning from the smoke, which is partly magical too, but it's all in this kind of enclosed temple structure. Mm-hmm. Whereas Shugendo, they take the Goma ritual and they put it in the mountains because that's where the power is. That's where the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and the local gods and the dragons are. So why not just hold it there? So you could have a small Goma ritual, say in front of a cave where there's a dragon believed to reside that sort of draws that dragon's power out. Or a big sort of bonfire festival is called the Saito Goma. And essentially that would be in front of a temple. And it might be a Buddhist temple, but there's also Shugendo practitioners there. And that is something that is performed for followers and sort of people within the community that are not professional practitioners of Shugendo, but they're there for the sort of magical benefits.
One thing that I'm aware of with practice of Shugendo is that there's a level of secrecy that pervades it today, for anyone who practices it today, for the uninitiated in terms of what they can discuss, is my understanding as to what they do. So firstly, are you a follower of Shugendo? And if not, how does that affect your ability as an academic to observe and research what is happening?
Yeah, good question. So how would I know about it if I'm not being initiated into these secrets? I am not a practitioner myself. I've done some field work to better understand it. I've spoken with and gotten to know practitioners of Shugendo, especially to understand it in a contemporary context, because I think the contemporary context is quite different than the historical one. In terms of how we know about Shugendo from the past, well, I think understanding the past in any subject is incredibly difficult and complex. I mean, I've just learned this by doing field work where you interview 20, 30 people and they all give you a different answer, right? Whereas if you're looking at a pre-modern text from, say, Togakushi's 15th century, that's the only text you have. And so you have to work with what's in that text, and you have to try to sort of read between the lines of what might be going on in terms of authorship and motivations behind putting something that's normally orally transmitted down into text. And so I think beyond just secrets that are passed on, there's so much other things that we don't know about when we look at history, that we have to take a pretty humble approach.
And among those practitioners of Shugendo, referred to as Shugenja, you have the Yamabushi, who are probably the most prominent or most well-known. And we previously actually spoke with a practicing Yamabushi on this podcast in episode 9, Tim Bunting, who practices in Yamagata. So again, can we talk about who the Yamabushi are and what defines their practice?
Yes. So Yamabushi literally means someone who lies down in the mountains. Yama is the mountain, right? And bushi or fushi is to lie down. And so that's sort of a literal meaning. And by extension, what that means is that it's someone who goes into the mountains for extended period of time, right? Sort of essentially overnights where they're going to sleep to. And this would have been very strange and rare historically in Japan, that people weren't shopping at Montbell and picking up a tent and going into the mountains, right? The mountains were thought of in very ambivalent terms, because on the one hand, the mountains were full of this divine power where you had local gods, you had sort of beings from the Buddhist pantheon, and then you had the water that came down that fed the crops, and the whole country is surrounded by mountains, right? I mean, you know this, especially living in Nagano. And so on that side, the mountains produce these blessings and they have an inherent power in them. And so the Yamabushi is someone who goes into basically unite with those beings in the mountains and gain that power. But the flip side of that is that the mountains were often viewed as very inhospitable, treacherous places. So most people are not going into the mountains. I mean, I'm sure plenty of your listeners climb in the mountains and maybe know about avalanches and landslides and lightning storms that can come unexpectedly. There's real dangers, and then there's also the perceived threats of ghosts and demons and all kinds of things, right? And so the Yamabushi were basically training themselves to go in there and navigate this treacherous terrain. And it was through their ritual techniques that they could then get by and basically gain something from it. At the same time, I think because they were going into this sort of otherworldly place, they could also be marginalized in society. So if you read medieval legends, from that are written in Kyoto, in the capital, but often discuss things going on in the mountains, often they were sort of treated as suspicious characters too. So basically, Yamabushi on the one side, people rely on them for all of these powers that they're gaining and sort of see them as sort of superhuman in some regards. And then at the other hand, they could occupy sort of a marginal place in society too.
So as mentioned, I became aware of your research through your 2022 publication, The Path into the Mountains, Shugendo and Mount Togakushi. Now, I live very nearby Togakushi. I guide there regularly. Actually, episode 12 of the podcast was my guide to Togakushi. So your book kind of immediately caught my attention. So I was going to start by asking, when in regards to Togakushi and the book, so Shugendo did not originate in Togakushi. So why did you choose to focus on Togakushi and its relationship with Shugendo as the focus of this book?
Yeah, I guess a number of reasons. One is that there's a lot of great scholarship on some of the main sacred mountains in Japan. And so I wanted to tackle a mountain that hadn't been covered, especially in English. I was also really interested in looking at Shugendo in terms of kind of a religion on the move, right? Not something that existed everywhere throughout time, but that actually was passed from one practitioner to another, from one place to another. And for that reason, I thought it'd be interesting to not maybe go to the most famous area, sort of birthplace of Shugendo, which would be the Kii Peninsula below Nara. We have the mountains of Omine and the Kumino shrines. So I thought it'd be interesting to go to a more peripheral site to see how it traveled there. And then there's some great scholarship in Japanese too on Togakushi. Some articles by a scholar named Sonehara Satoshi in particular. And he actually traced the transmission of Shugendo from a mountain called Hikosan, which is actually closer to me now in Kyushu, northern Kyushu, and its transmission to Togakushi in the early 16th century. And that's quite rare to have that sort of record, right? That actually was written down. And so that was sort of a starting point to think about, okay, what is the mountain before Shugendo? Because it's essentially a Tendai Buddhist site. So they're also doing ascetic practices. They're worshiping this 9-headed dragon there and other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Then thinking about, okay, once Shugendo comes in, why are they interested in it? Why do they gravitate toward it? And how does the site change in part through Shugendo? And so all of those factors made it a really interesting site. I didn't go there until I chose the site, but when I got there, I felt like I'd made the right choice because as a mountain climber myself, it's just an amazing peak, right? As you know.
Did you go up the mountain?
Yeah, at least once with some climbing friends.
Can we go into that? Because I've never been up to the summit of the mountain, and anyone I've spoken to locally, it's quite a notorious mountain, quite a challenging mountain, and the advice I was always given was, even if you are an experienced mountaineer, which I'm not, by the way, but even if you are, local people always go up with a local guide because it is known as a dangerous mountain. How was your experience going up?
It was thrilling in some sections, I would say, but I felt within my comfort zone too, having climbed, 4th class terrain and 5th class terrain. I mean, the one interesting thing about it is that Togakushi is quite a technical peak to climb, and so historically, not many practitioners of Shugendo climbed it, or I would say the sort of seasoned Yamabushi were climbing it. But in the Edo period, Togakushi and then other mountains around the country began opening up to pilgrims or to these sort of pilgrimage associations. And they didn't choose Togakushi because I think it's just too technical. Instead, they chose Takatsuma, which is kind of behind, and it's a big cone volcanic peak in terms of its shape, and so it's not technical. But it was considered part of these sort of Togakushi mountains.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Togakushi is not a tall mountain; it's 1,904 meters, so comparatively to even some of the surrounding mountains, it's notably shorter, and then the Northern Alps are much nearby, and they're much higher. But it does have a reputation as a very technical and challenging mountain. On that note, are you able to describe the general topography of Togakushi, and especially how the shrine complex, which is there today, is laid out?
The area around there has a few cone volcanoes. Togakushi is not. It's a long kind of ridge line, and I think it formed through partly volcanic activity, but also through folding and uplift. It's kind of this jagged ridgeline that goes along. And you almost could imagine that being like the heads of a dragon, right? Because it's this 9-headed dragon that is thought to reside there. And so I thought that was interesting looking at it and being like, I wonder if people sort of imagined the actual shape of the mountain. And then in terms of the shrines there, well, first of all, these were temples before the Meiji period. But as typical with a sacred mountain in Japan, there's often a sort of innermost temple that's kind of closest to the mountain itself. It's sort of around the foot, maybe part way up. And because it's closest to the mountain, it's seen as that's where, the most important rituals take place. That's where ascetics will go in and perform rituals and then depart from there if they're going into the mountains. And so that shrine is called Okusha. Below it, farther down in a few different valleys, you have Hokosha and Chusha, which are two major shrines. All of these sites developed as far back as the 11th century. But then in the Edo period, because the mountain was becoming sort of a pilgrimage site, and pilgrims would often travel up through Zenkoji, through your backyard, there were all these kind of pilgrimage lodges, and they were managed by Tendai priests and Shugenja. Pilgrims would stay there. Often they were guided up by the Yamabushi. Then they would be guided up Takatsuma-san. And these would be male pilgrims. So women were not allowed to climb the mountains themselves, and we can get into that too. But they could come as far as these two main shrines of Chusha, or Chuin as it was known in the Edo period, and Hokuin.
Let's want to step back for a moment there, because you've made reference a few times there to what our shrines today were once temples. Can you go into a little detail as to why that is the case?
In terms of this switch over from Buddhist temples to Shinto shrines, this is a major kind of radical change that's issued by the new Meiji government in 1868. And they're basically attempting to separate Buddhist institutions from Shinto institutions, because up until then, these were very integrated complexes in terms of ritual and staff and the buildings themselves. The Meiji government was sort of concerned more ideologically with having what they thought should be a sort of pure form of Japanese Shinto that had been corrupted by Buddhism as foreign, right? Which is quite problematic when you think about the fact that Buddhism had been around for over a millennia and was deeply, entrenched in the culture. And the places where this was especially radically implemented was at mountain temples, which were mostly Buddhist. By converting to Shinto shrines, these sites were sort of compelled by the government to do that. There was essentially an overnight shift, and with that, there was mass destruction of Buddhist icons, for example. Buddhist texts, all kinds of Buddhist knowledge was lost. Because that was so effective, when you go to a place like Togakushi now, it seems like a typical Shinto shrine. But that's because of that relatively recent history.
And I think it is exactly that process, which is obviously very complex. And I imagine there's a lot of debate as to exactly how it took place and the effect it had on local belief systems that already existed. But one thing I was very interested, Caleb, in the book was when you talked about the mountain being opened, the terminology, the mountain being opened, and in order to do so, a local deity was tamed or appeased by a particular individual, sometimes named, sometimes unnamed. But there are different accounts of how this occurred at Togakushi. So again, could you go into a little detail as to why are there different accounts as to this, how the mountain was opened, the deity that was appeased, and who actually appeased it? Why are there those competing narratives?
Yeah, no, I love that question, because I think stories are something that we often sort of think of now as fictional or as not that important. But I think, in fact, at many sites, including Togakushi, it was these kind of narratives, right? Sort of origin legends and accounts that provided a basically legitimacy to whoever was trying to kind of assert control over the mountain or develop a presence there, that they would weave their own history into the mountain's origins. And so what happens at Togakushi is there's this story. The earliest version is from around the 13th century. And basically, it's a monk who seems very Tendai-esque. He does things like chant the Lotus Sutra, which is the main scripture in the Tendai school. And basically, he's traveling along, and he comes to Mount Togakushi, and he encounters this sort of noxious presence there, sort of rising from the mountains. Almost, perhaps, this is totally speculative, but maybe there was volcanic activity at the time. And so these fumes that were seen as quite potent in a dangerous but also efficacious way. So essentially the story is about him going there. He encounters this 9-headed demon, is how it's portrayed, with a long tail. And when he begins chanting the Lotus Sutra, it has this total conversion to Buddhism. And it becomes a protector of the Buddha and the Buddhist temples, the Tendai tradition. And so that sort of provides a way for Tendai priests to talk about their presence at the mountain by referring to that story. And it becomes kind of the basis of the what you referred to a minute ago is the opening of the mountain. And opening is sort of a weird thing to say in English, but essentially that's a literal translation from Kaizan, or the opening of the mountain in Japanese, which would mean that up until that point, because there's no Buddhist presence, it's sort of an uncivilized place full of dangerous spirits and no place that humans should ever go. And so it's sort of a ritual opening by chanting the Lotus Sutra. this priest converts the local being to Buddhism, and through that conversion, that local being becomes this magnificent dragon who's now enlightened too. And over time, that story changes according to different storytellers, what they're looking for in the story, how they see themselves as part of the story too.
Another thing of specific interest to me was the practice of peak entry, which is a defining component of Shugendo, and central to that is the conceptualization of mountains as mandalas. So in terms of Togakushi, this involves the superimposition of two mandalas, if I'm not mistaken. And they are specific mandalas, the mandala of two realms and the mandala of two divisions, correct me if I'm wrong on that, onto Mount Takatsuma, that you've already referred to, and Mount Ototsuma, which rise up behind Mount Togakushi effectively. Again, can you go into a bit of detail as to how that works?
A mandala essentially is a diagram of the cosmos, right? It's a map, and that cosmos might include the world, it might include the individual practitioner, right? But it's sort of a map of where all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and deities in the Buddhist pantheon reside within this cosmic diagram. And mandala, there's two primary mandalas, the diamond realm mandala and the womb realm mandala. One sort of encompasses compassion, and the other one, the diamond, sort of advancement toward wisdom. Initially, they're used inside temples, and so a practitioner will perform rituals in which they'll identify with a particular being, divinity within one of these mandalas. And then that's a way to sort of advance their own spiritual state. And here's another example where Shugenja say, okay, let's take that outside. Even predating Shugenja, Buddhists are saying, okay, actually maybe the mountains, which are also this place where we can advance ourselves along the path, maybe they also encompass this kind of cosmic diagram. And so Kukai, for instance, thinks of Mount Koyasan as embodying the two mandala. Later on, Buddhist priests will think of the two main shrines at Ise as comprising these two mandala. And so this system, this sort of way of understanding the landscape, travels to different sites around the country. And Togakushi is another example of that, where these two mountains are seen as mandalas. So there's all different reasons to go into the mountains, the mandala aspect being one of them. But peak entry is sort of the ritualized process of Yamabushi going into the mountains. They'd go in and identifying with these Buddhas and other gods in the mountains through these mandalized circuits. They would acquire these powers and then they'd come out, and then they'd be sort of, maybe on an individual level, sort of spiritually advanced, but also on a sort of communal level, charged with this, energy, this powerful energy from the mountain. And so what often would follow the peak entry would be these more public performances outside of temples, where they would show off these new powers that they had developed. So the fire, right? Being able to control fire. This was a power they would cultivate. And then as the fire of the Saito Goma dies down, you have the embers, and they would walk across the embers to show the power too that they'd built up. Or they'd climb up a ladder made of sword blades. So all these different things were ways of expressing, like, okay, after these rigors in the mountains, we really are special. We do have amazing powers, and they would gain followers that way.
One thing I definitely wanted to ask, because it was a repeated topic within the book, was the question of restrictions on women entering the mountains, specifically in the case of Togakushi. So am I correct in saying that there's incomplete or potentially contradictory evidence in some regards that suggests there may have never been a complete ban on women entering the mountains in Togakushi?
I think that's just it, that we have an incomplete picture of what happened with women's exclusion. Maybe to take a step back, earlier, there were mountains like Hiezan and Koyasan, Omine, that basically the monks there banned women. And part of that was Buddhist influences coming in. Part of it may have been related to court purification protocols too. But over the medieval period, this discourse spread that because of menstruation and childbirth, the fluids produced through both of those, that women were physically impure, and that to go into the mountains risked angering the gods, which was a bad thing in terms of, violent storms, havoc to crops and agriculture and all that. At Togakushi, the case was quite interesting because the evidence is unclear from the medieval period. And in fact, in the 15th century, and at a text I looked at, there seems to be a contestation of this exclusionary practice. And so that's within the text that's sort of authored by, priests at the mountain themselves. So that seemed quite interesting. There's also extant woodblock kind of protocols, printed protocols from that time period, specifying the conditions of exclusion. So around the menstrual cycle or childbirth, women couldn't enter. Neither could their husbands. So that just shows that the picture is a bit murkier than the sort of common idea that all sacred mountains just prohibited women, which I don't think is very useful either, because it sort of further erases their presence from the mountains, because I think women were very devoted to mountain deities like men too, and sometimes did go up. It's another reason why I think we have to look at traditions like Shugendo as constantly changing and also different depending on the location, so that it's not some widespread ban that was in place across Japan, anything like that. It was much more local and specific to different conditions.
Yeah, I found it particularly interesting. And I know today for contemporary practitioners of Shugendo that at least some now allow women to partake in Yamabushi practice, which leads me on to that question. How would you describe the current status of Shugendo in Japan today? And are there any estimates of how many practitioners of Shugendo there are?
I don't know of any estimates. I think that would be very difficult statistically to find out. But you do have the traditional confraternities, that these are kind of associations. Some of them are more connected to, say, Shinto. Some of them are connected to mountain worship, that especially emerge out of the Meiji period. And there are numbers for those in terms of sort of an annual count of who's a member of those. Even those numbers are murky because we don't know. Someone's name might be registered, but they haven't been in 20 years.
Yep.
And it's only when they die that their name is removed. So it's very difficult to know. But those have been on the decline for a long time now, at least since post-war. As those members age and their children don't follow the same tradition. So those are in decline. But on the flip side, you have new interests in Shugendo that speak to often younger people, often people in the cities, or people that live near these mountains that are curious about their history and then want to start kind of rediscovering Shugendo at the local level. And so all of that activity is very interesting, and it's sort of off the records in terms of actual numbers, but I think it's occurring at around Kumino and Yoshino and Dewa-sanzan and Hiko-san and Togakushi a little bit too. So that's all quite exciting for Shugendo, I think, moving forward.
Probably my final question for you actually was, what do you see as the future of Shugendo and as Japan continues along its path?
That's an interesting question. And on one level, who knows? I think, in terms of where things will go, you can't really make predictions. But I think Shugendo is very small scale, right? Even many Japanese will just, have no idea what I'm talking about when I say I study Shugendo. Maybe a little bit more if I mention Yamabushi. So I think it's been small scale, and that's partly I can't remember if this came up in the conversation, but it was actually banned in 1872 by the government as part of these orders of separating Shinto and Buddhism because it was so integrative of the two systems. So it did make a comeback in the 20th century, and that I would say accelerated in the 1980s and into the 21st century as local traditions have emerged. And so I think that will probably continue. I think there's a great interest in the outdoors and in getting into the mountains as a way of kind of personal rejuvenation. One thing that Shugendo groups that are operating now do is they provide kind of an introduction into the mountains and something that goes beyond just simply hiking, that has a bit more meaning to it in terms of cultural heritage and tradition. And then also one's own kind of maybe self-cultivation in the mountains.
So for anyone interested in learning more about Shugendo or experiencing it firsthand, where would you recommend that they begin?
Well, there's good books on it. One, thanks for mentioning mine. I won't say it's good, but at least it's out there. There's
It's good.
There's one called Defining Shugendo, which is fairly recent. There's also some really good movies out there. Shugendo Now is one of my favorites, and I always have students watch that. And so those are some maybe resources that folks will find useful. I think in terms of finding a place to practice, that gets a little bit trickier. But I would say as a starting point, if you live in Japan, consider the nearest sacred mountain, right? And just go there and ask if there's any activity going on. And often it's through those kind of one-on-one connections and just asking locals around that you might run into someone who's practicing. It's a little bit easier if you live around Dewa Sanzan or if you're traveling there.
Yeah, sure.
Or, Yoshino area, there's a temple called Sakura Motobo that is doing more outreach in terms of initiating people at all levels. Yamabushi Taiken is something that is promoted by temples if they want to bring in new people. Taiken meaning, you sort of try out what it's like to be a Yamabushi for the day. So I think there's lots of opportunities out there. It helps to know some Japanese, of course.
Okay, look, thank you so much for making time to speak with me. I know it's getting into the evening there in Boston, so I'm sure you'd be very happy to sign off and go and enjoy the evening. I want to say again, thank you so much for the book. It's a real personal interest to me. It's really aided and enhanced my understanding of Togakushi and even deepened my interest, because obviously there's a lot more I'd like to ask you, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. And I assume at some point you'll be passing through this area again, maybe to Togakushi or Nagano. Please let me know if you do. I'd love to meet in person, and all the best with the rest of your time over there. So thank you.
Absolutely, Peter. Thanks so much for the invitation to talk about my research. I always love doing that. Nice to meet a fellow ginger online too, and perhaps around Zenkoji at some point. Thanks a lot, Peter.
That's it for today's episode. A very big thank you to Caleb for agreeing to speak and the research he's doing, which is of personal interest. Also, for his willingness to speak at what was later in the evening in Boston. Very much appreciated. You'll find links to the book and his Kyushu University profile in the show notes. Images related to the episode can be found on the Outland Japan Instagram and Facebook pages. Just search Outland Japan, while you can find all episodes on the website outlandjapan.com and our YouTube channel, Outland Japan Pod. I'm looking forward to bringing you a lot more episodes in 2025 as we continue to explore rural, regional, and the wilds of Japan. I'll be back with the next episode in a couple of weeks' time. Wishing everyone a happy new year and a prosperous, successful, and let's hope, peaceful 2025. Bye for now.